Hi, I'm Mark Madison, the historian at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, and I'd like to welcome you to another of our series of Conservationists in Action. Today we have quite a distinguished scientist and amateur filmmaker. We have William Sladen joining us this afternoon, and before William begins, I'd like to just tell you a little about him. He is currently Professor Emeritus at Johns Hopkins Medical Institutions. He's also Director Emeritus of the Swan Research Program. He's got an amazing resume, and we'll talk about some of his research, but just to give you a brief overview, he's a research scientist, an explorer, a filmmaker, a polar bird expert, especially Antarctic penguins, swans, and geese. He's also an amateur botanist, having made collections for the British Museum of Natural History and the Smithsonian. He's an enthusiastic supporter of organic and sustainable agriculture with his wife Jocelyn. He promotes habitat restoration that encourages native flora and fauna. He pioneered techniques in capture, circumpolar marking, radio telemetry of polar birds, and more recently with his team at Airlie, teaching geese and trumpeter swans migration routes with ultralight aircraft that spawned the popular Hollywood movie you may recall called Fly Away Home. He has over 130 scientific papers to his credits, and his film to illustrate his research have been shown on all major U.S. TV stations and worldwide. He has numerous awards, and perhaps most intriguing, he gave up medicine and plastic surgery for championing conservation around the world. So welcome, William. It's a real pleasure to have you here, and we're just very excited to have you here. We're interested in many of the same things you are.
Well, thank you, and this is my second visit to your training center, and I just congratulate you on having such a wonderful place.
Well, hopefully it won't be your last.
And I'm really glad to see that bald eagle nest is still up there.
It's up there.
It's wonderful.
Yep.
Yes.
Well,
So
why don't you tell us how you came to be involved with the Fish and Wildlife Service? That would be of interest to our folks.
Well, yeah, I came over from England, having done my training as a medical guy. I came over in 1956, so that's sort of some time ago. And the first thing I did was to get down to Patuxent Research Center and made my friends with the bird banding laboratory, as well as with Carlton Herman, who was the head of the disease lab. I was very interested in aspergillosis, which was a problem with swans, and also a very big problem with penguins. So I did a lot of work there, and then as soon as I could get to Alaska, I got there.
Good.
And of course, when you get to Alaska in the late 60s, you encounter a guy by name of Jim King, who, if I can remember correctly, he was the first manager of the Clarence, what was then called the Clarence Road Refuge in Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. And he had a plane. He was the waterfowl biologist, and the only way to deal with swans in Alaska is by plane. And so we entered into a fantastic arrangement whereby he wanted to get birds banded, and I was developing a technique for neck bands and also for radios. And so we did a lot of work together. So that was my introduction to not only America, but also to Fish and Wildlife and to Alaska and to Jim King.
He references you quite a bit, actually, in a fairly recent book of his called Attending Alaska's Birds, and I think we have a picture of that. And one of the more amusing stories is you trying to chase down a swan. Do you recall?
Well, yes, when you're in a float plane, and by the way, we started with a beaver, which was pretty noisy, and a beaver. Then he graduated to the turboprop. But when you're in a beaver and you go a little bit too fast to get the birds, and you get on a sandbar, it's very difficult getting off that sandbar. It only happens just very, very occasionally,
Right.
but with the turboprop, it could reverse and go straight
Sure.
back. So it was terrific. But anyway, the technique that we developed was to gently push them on land, and then when the propeller has stopped, it's very important.
Yes.
When the propeller has stopped, you jump out and chase them down. And I wrote an article for the National Geographic in 1975, July 1975, which showed a picture. They wanted a picture of me chasing a poor little young swan over the tundra. But anyway, so that's the technique. Now with a helicopter, of course, it's so much easier. You hide and drive the swans slowly towards the young people who are meant to run. And they just leap out and catch the bird. I should explain that the birds are flightless.
Yes.
They have an annual, all waterfowl have an annual molt.
So you have a fighting shot at them.
Yes, and another technique, of course, is to catch them in the water with when you're on the float and with a net. And that's requires a lot of skill. The trouble is if the bird decides to dive and get away and do a right-handed turn, you give up. You give up and go to another bird, because once they've got that technique, they can repeat it.
What were some of the new tracking techniques you guys were doing up in Alaska? I alluded to them very briefly in your bio.
Well, I had I don't know, not many people remember, but in 1962, November 1962, a Viscount aircraft, turboprop from United Airlines crashed over Ellicott City in Maryland, and all were killed on board. That was just after another crash of a turbo in Boston from Starlings. So, as is usually the case, when you have dead bodies, something happens, and there was money released in the mid-60s for bird hazards to aircraft, and so we got in on the bird hazards of swans, and nobody knew the migration route of the swans, and that's very interesting, because Jim and I were with Jim Bartonek, who was the Pacific Flyway manager for some time. The three of us were in his aircraft surveying the swans and looking for some that we could catch. And this is in my National Geographic article. I saw an orange-dyed swan below, and in those days we dyed them with picric acid, and we dyed them with different patterns. So in other words, this pattern had this bird had a port side yellow, whereas another bird would have a starboard side, another one would have 4, another one would have 4. So I knew that this was one, because it was on the left side, I knew this was one of 28 birds that we'd banded just in the West River near Annapolis. Yeah. And to our amazement, it was up here on the northern slope of Alaska. So most of the birds in Alaska go down on the Pacific Flyway. Right. So we then defined the flyway eastern population, starting off on the northern slope of Alaska, north of the range of the mountain range, all the way to the Northwest Territories, down to, in those days, most of the birds, 30 years, 40 years ago, they wintered in Chesapeake Bay. When Chesapeake Bay went dead or bad with pollution, then they moved further down into North Carolina. So, and then the birds on western Alaska, of course, go down into Utah and into San Joaquin Valley. So it was quite interesting. That was one of the things we did, and we had about 100 volunteers looking for neckbands, and we were also pioneering in radios, but with a radio it only lasts as far as the battery goes unless you have a solar cell on, which we tried, and that was quite good. But the neckbands last for the bird's life. And so we were following some birds near the Helmrichs village in Colville Delta for 5 years. We knew exactly where they were breeding, exactly where they were wintering, and it was pretty exciting. And now we're doing a similar study with support from ConocoPhillips in the oil fields. We're doing a similar study with those birds. Our biologist, John Whistle, has been working and collaborating with Craig Ely in Alaska, implanting some of these satellites, radios. And it's a very interesting project because we're trying to get school kids away from their addiction to, you know what?
Yeah, TV or video games.
The radio and the computer. So we're putting satellites on females that don't fight, and regular VHF that go beep, beep, beep on the males. And so the kids can follow the satellite, and then when the bird gets near to the school, we hope they intimidate the school teacher. So get into the bus and go out, and we can loan them the receiver and actually see the birds together where they are, and then of course learn about the wetlands. The swans, of course, are not all that important. They're beautiful and they're
right.
popular, but they're not all that important. The worms are probably more important, as you know.
And according to the invertebrate specialist.
Yes, according to and according to, and the botany.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
that's really interesting. Does that program have a name, or is there a website if people want to learn more
yes,
about
there's
it?
a website called Swan Migration, one word, swanmigration.org. So they can look this up, and it's a little bit complicated for me, but these young people know. 5-year-olds can put me to shame already.
Well, it's a great way to get kids out in nature, too.
It is, yes. And so it's very important for them to use the computer, but to get out into the natural world. I think it's a fairly unique project in that respect.
It sounds like a fascinating experiment with kids. What about your ultralight migration work? How did you get into that?
We got into that because Bill Lishman, who founded the Operation Migration, who's working, or he started with the whooping cranes more recently, which is very successful. He showed a film at a Trumpeter Swan Society meeting called Come On Geese. It won a prize for education and research. And he showed this, how he got into the air with his ultralight, which he made himself, and trained geese to follow him. And me being a private citizen and not government,
right,
hit the ceiling in excitement and said, "Come on, let's do this." And it's a long story. It took us about 3 years to get the permit, but we did it. And we did it with our, I shouldn't be saying guinea pigs, we did it with our test birds, the geese. And it was resoundingly successful. The geese not only followed his plane down to Airlie, where we live, the Airlie Centre, conference centre. We looked after them for the winter, and they returned. And it's a long story.
Yeah.
They returned to his home. Almost all of them returned to his home, so we thought this would be worthwhile doing it with swans. And there's no way that we can release trumpeter swans into the flyway at the moment without the Atlantic flyway's permission, so we've sort of rather given that up at the moment. We have to work on an easier and a less expensive technique for teaching the migration route. Otherwise they're going to be resident like the resident geese, which are becoming a problem. But it's been very successful, extremely successful with the whooping crane. I'm sure you all know about that.
Right, we're engaged in that.
It's a terrific, yes. Very expensive and rather dangerous. So we have
the birds or the pilots?
Dangers to the pilots and dangers to the birds. We have other methods which we're working on at the moment, which are less expensive. But it all depends on a little bit of money.
Yes.
As you know. So, yes.
You mentioned something we have a million questions about constantly out here, and that is geese or migratory waterfowl that stop migrating. What causes that? Because we get that question perennially. Why are the Canada geese not migrating? Why are these species not migrating?
You know, we should explain that, and my wife Jocelyn keeps on telling me that you have to explain why we have a flock of resident geese as opposed to migratory geese.
Right.
And the simple answer is geese, swans and cranes and probably other birds have lost their ability to migrate by instinct, like the warblers and the finches. They have to learn a migration from their parents. They have to learn a migration from their parents. These are flocking birds. And correct me if I'm wrong, when live decoys were outlawed in the 1930s, I'm not very good at my dates, but somewhere around 1930s.
The early 20th century, yeah.
Yeah, about 30,000 pinioned that couldn't fly geese were released into the bay, and they were released all over the country. And of course, Fish and Wildlife, in its infinite wisdom, by the way,
always
said the more geese, the more there are to collect by the hunting method and to eat. So these geese took a fair time to get themselves oriented, but they couldn't fly, therefore their young, they couldn't teach their young a migration route. So it's as simple as that. So, and that's what they fear about the trumpeter swan. If we just release them, they need to be taught a migration route. So the resident geese have multiplied like anything, and yes, of course, the ones in New York when they get, or the ones in Ohio when they get frozen out, they come south and they work out their own migration route.
Right.
What the ultralight technique does is to show them what we believe, or what you all believe, is a safe migration route that doesn't necessarily go over cities and goes from one refuge to another. And it's a good technique, but it's very expensive.
Yeah.
So that's the explanation of resident geese.
That's fascinating.
And the other ones, the migratory geese, continue because they're learning from the Arctic how to migrate from their parents.
Well, another aspect of your varied career has been filmmaking. In fact, last time we talked, you mentioned you'd made a film very early on, but tell me how you got into the natural history.
Well,
filmmaking.
Filming. I've always been interested in filming, and when I first went down to the Antarctic, I was with Vivian Fuchs, who later was the first one to cross the Antarctic. He collaborated with the late Sir Edmund. They're both dead. Late Sir Edmund Hillary, who came up from the Ross Sea side, the south of New Zealand, whereas Fuchs came from the Weddell Sea side, from the Antarctic Peninsula side. I went down in 1948 and spent my first winter at Hope Bay at the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, and started getting involved with penguins. I was asked by the Colonial Office when I went for my interview, Doc, what are you going to do in your spare time? And I said, I'm going to study penguins. And they said, what? Penguins? Why don't you study constipation in the Antarctic? You've got to do something medical. Well, I'll never forget how we fed pemmican to our husky dogs when we were doing surveys, and they weren't constipated. They were not constipated. We will not discuss that. We won't discuss that. But I felt it was very important, particularly when you're studying behavior, ethology. Nico Tinbergen, who got the Nobel Prize with Konrad Lorenz for medicine, was one of my examiners when I got my PhD at Oxford. Very important to illustrate your research, and particularly with behavior, with filming. So I made a film during my tenure, my first tenure with the British Antarctic Survey, in 1948 and then 1951, and that was shown. My first film in America. Oh, well, my first films were shown on TV with Sir Peter Scott. Peter Scott was the son. He was 3 years old when his dad, Captain Scott, died on his way back from the South Pole.
Yeah.
And he was 3 years old. And Peter, I think Peter is probably the greatest conservationist. He helped found the World Wildlife Fund and the book and all that stuff. But he was one of the first TV showers, had a very good voice, and in fact he had a program called Look, and I showed my film then. Then CBS were interested, and I did my first film, TV film on the penguin behavior in New York with Charles Collingwood, who's long since been dead. And then later I did another film to illustrate our Johns Hopkins Antarctic penguin research in Cape Crozier. That was 1970, and I narrated it with Charles Carroll. And I'm going to show that this evening at your thing. BBC didn't like my soft British voice, and by the way, I haven't had any reason to change it since I've been here in 1956. They wanted another British voice, so they got Peter Scott to narrate the film when it was shown on BBC. But it's a fun film.
Well, we have some excerpts, I think, from one of those films.
Oh, really? Okay.
Can we show that?
Yeah, let's have a look at it. Yeah, sure.
All right.
All penguins look alike. We, man, cannot easily tell their sexes or ages. How can we recognize them so that we can study Penguin City? The method is banding. The man who has done this is Dr. William Sladen on the left, a Johns Hopkins University ecologist who has spent 8 years in Antarctica collecting this data with National Science Foundation and Navy support, and whose film this is. Dr. Sladen and his Johns Hopkins colleagues use bands with easily read numbers and color codes to identify the birds. It's a quick and painless procedure for the penguins. The birds will wear these bands for the rest of their lives. When they are released, they soon forget that man has given them an identity, and the scientists can study them from a distance without disturbing the life in Penguin City.
That was great film footage, and you shot?
Yeah, I shot it all. Yes, I went down I had to do a lot of teaching, so every other year I went down, and one of my postdoctoral students was also led the thing. But the important thing about this project, and it's still going on, this started in 1959, And we banded, during my time, I finished in 1970, we banded 50,000 penguins, about 5,000 youngsters, young birds, as you saw in the film, every year to build up a population of known age. And it's absolutely fascinating when you know that bird as an individual and its age. And you get all this fantastic behavior, teenage behavior, hooligan behavior. We like to call it keeping company, but basically it's
a nice
it's taking a mistress or whatever it is. But it's all, and it's really so wonderful. And it's what we're trying to do with the swans, trying to band not so many as this, but band some youngsters so that we know the age. And they're very different when they're those teenagers, you know, the wanderers were just typical juveniles.
Yeah.
I'm talking about penguins, by the way.
Well, I saw some similar
Can't make up their
circumstances. So what is this thing you brought to our table here?
Well, I thought that this, you know, this is shown in the film, in Return to Penguin City. It's a string vest. A string vest that we were issued in 1947 by the British to keep warm. What's wrong with it?
How well did that work?
It works beautifully. And there's a picture of me in the film, topless, putting this on in Shackleton's 1907 hut at Cape Royds, near McMurdo Station. But and notice I did wash it. Before I put it in the.
Perhaps you'll be modeling it tonight.
Yes. I'll have that as a demonstration. But yes. So the penguins are fascinating, really fascinating birds. And I was a little bit distressed with March of the Penguins, which was so popular. They have not. We banded penguins. I've bought a demonstration of the flipper bands that we put on penguins. They were Teflon. A lot of that behavior on the edge of the colony was juvenile behavior, not parents that had lost their young. Juvenile behavior. And until you mark these birds and know them as individuals, as we do with the swans, the geese, and the neckbands, or whatever it is, you're not going to find that out.
So they were kind of misrepresenting some.
Well, it's not necessarily misrepresenting, but yeah, it's lack of knowledge, and I don't think that sort of research has been done with the emperors. Don't forget you had to put the bands on in minus 70 degrees.
Right. But you had a string vest.
Yeah, with the string vest, of course, yes, absolutely.
Well, there's one other important project you worked on that we haven't had a chance to touch on yet, and that was a joint one between the U.S. and the USSR and Wrangel. You want to tell us a little about that?
Yes, that was a real wonderful privilege. The leader of our group, well, first of all, it was started under President Nixon due to Russell Train's enthusiasm for the for environment and conservation, and I was one of the first committee that went over. There was and our leader, of course, it had to be a government person. It was Joe Linduska, who was a terrific guy.
Yeah, sure.
From Fish and Wildlife, he was our leader, and Earl Basinger was also there from the bird banding lab, I think. And I wanted the Russians or the Soviets to do work on swans. They said, "Oh no, we don't. We're very interested in swans, but we want to know what's happening with our snow geese. Snow geese that breed on Wrangel Island in northeast Siberia, 300 miles west of Alaska. What happens to our birds? There are too many being shot by your hunters in California. Please," and I was known for my neckband project, so we got a neckband thing going for snow geese, and I was the first Westerner to be invited to Wrangel Island in July 1975, which was a great privilege, and of course we started the project going with U.S. Fish and Wildlife metal bands in
okay,
Russia.
sure.
Yeah, so that was great. And of course we dyed them red to fit in with the Soviet color, of course. And it was a great thing. And then, of course, I didn't want to go the second time, and I think Jim Bartonek, representing Fish and Wildlife, and then I think it was handed over to the Washington State people, and they've done very well. They were reduced very much by marginal weather there. But when we knew, and this was interesting, when we knew that the Russian birds arrived in California before the more plentiful ones from Canada, just delaying the hunting season for a little bit made so much difference to the birds. Birds are now probably more common, just as common as the ones in the east population. So what I like to think is that we contributed a little bit to ending the Cold War.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily Reagan or what we're hearing all about. You know, it was the scientists that went there.
Oh yeah, that was a great discovery too.
Yeah, and when I went to revisited Wrangel Island, we met just 29 years later. The biologist who was in charge of the snow goose was a student when I was there, and he said, "You know, Bill, we thought you were all spies." So it was important. It was very important. When we had and this was very interesting. When we had a reception at Oxford, my college, Wadham College at Oxford, during the third International Swan Symposium, we had a delegation from Russia. I had a special reception for them at my college, and then we weren't able to get across the Bering Straits. So we had a toast for getting across the Bering Straits, and of course a few years later Fish and Wildlife planes were flying across the Bering Straits, and they're doing some fantastic work on the eider ducks and other things. Yeah. So the Bering Straits is a very interesting place for the swans, where the two migratory swans in Eurasia, the Hooper and the Buick, are beginning to intermingle with our tundra swan and trumpeter swan. So, yeah.
These have been fascinating stories, Bill, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about the medical malady we put up your title. But what exactly are you suffering from?
I'm bipolar because I got my PhD at the South Pole, or near enough anyway, on penguins, and I got and we've been working on snow geese and swans north of the Arctic Circle. So I'm bipolar, and you know, I didn't realize that I'm a medical guy, but I haven't practiced for a long time. I didn't realize that this is a new terminology for something quite serious. So anyway, I'm okay. At least I hope.
But you must be. Do a lot of scientists go back and forth between the North Pole and South Pole, or do, in your experience, have they tended to specialize in one or the other?
I think there's a lot. National Science Foundation have done a tremendous job in doing that. Yes, I think so. In fact, there's a division of polar studies, which includes the Antarctic. They have a separate division on polar studies, which is Antarctic and Arctic. So, and the birds have no boundaries. I mean, it's amazing what the birds do. The Wilson's petrel goes back and forth. It breeds in the Antarctic, winters in the North Atlantic. Some of these shorebirds go but stay in South America. But the great bipolar bird is our Arctic tern, which breeds in the Arctic well north of the Arctic Circle, and spends the winter in the Antarctic pack ice. It does, I think, it has 22 hours of sunlight and 22 or 24,000 miles round trip each year.
Well,
amazing.
Bill, this has been a wonderful pleasure. As we were sitting here, I just realized we're celebrating your 60th anniversary of being involved in filmmaking. So that's, I don't think we've had anybody who's has as long a pedigree in natural history filmmaking as you, and it's been incredibly illuminating, and just thank you so much for your time, and we're looking forward to the talk tonight.
I'm very happy, and I have very happy memories of fish and wildlife. I just want to make sure that I survive until November 2010, when I will be going down to the Antarctic in an icebreaker, lecturing, hopefully, and I will be then celebrating my 8th decade of Antarctic involvement, and we could do the same with the North too. But we'll have to work out something with the fish and wildlife in the North.
And we'll have to bring you back out.
We need Jim King to survive too.
Well, thank you, Bill. Really appreciate it. I'd like to thank everybody that took the time to tune in this afternoon. And our next Conservationist in Action distance broadcast will be J.B. Rule. He's an attorney who's going to talk about climate change and the Endangered Species Act. Thank you very much.